Thank you very much, Raymond. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I know a little bit about Bridges' work, and a lot of what Raymond's just said has really chimed with my own personal experience. So before I tell you a little bit about myself, can I just invite you all to stand up? Thank you. So all you need to do is follow instructions. So I would like you to stay standing if you or any member of your family has ever experienced any kind of mental illness. So my own experience is depression. It could be that, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, any kind of mental illness at all. Please stay standing if that is the case. Okay, thank you. So that's most of us in the room, as we would expect at an event like this. So I now would invite you to stay standing if you have been able to be completely open about that experience of mental illness with your colleagues in your place of work, with your family. If you felt absolutely able to stand up a little bit like me and talk about your experience of mental illness, please stay standing if that's the case, and otherwise, please could you sit down? Okay, thank you very much. You can all sit down now. The reason I start like that is I think that stigma is something that Raymond didn't touch on, but I think when we're thinking about what works in well-being, I think one thing that we have to establish before we do anything else, that even in a really interested, engaged audience like you who are coming to a conference for a charity like Bridge, even here in this room in 2017, we find it really hard to acknowledge our own experience of mental illness. So before we even think about what works in well-being, I think one of the things that I'd like to sort of start off is to say that for me to really stand here before you as someone who feels well and recovered after a long experience of depression, I think that was one of the very first things I had to acknowledge, was that I had suffered, and I did suffer from a mental illness, and I had to do something about it. Okay, so I'll just tell you a little bit about my story. So we could rewind. So we're back to 1997. I'm looking around the room. Some of you perhaps weren't alive then. But anyway, so if you remember, we've got the Blair landslide election. At that point, I am a junior reporter, and I'm working in the Times newspaper. I've got a good life. I'm busy. I'm quite anxious. I've always been quite anxious, but things are good. I've got 2 small children, and my husband works in financial services. And things are okay, pretty exciting really, a kind of job I always wanted, but I am quite stressed. And then what happened was that one night, I couldn't get to sleep. Now, I've had patches of insomnia before, but this insomnia is rather different. So with this insomnia comes some quite alarming physical symptoms. So my heart rate speeds up, I feel like I need to vomit. My thoughts get more and more catastrophic. I later discover that this kind of catastrophizing is a very common way of thinking when you suffer from high anxiety. And my thoughts are going something like this. Well, if I don't get to sleep, I can't get to work. If I can't get to work, I can't pay the bills. I can't pay the bills, can't pay the mortgage. Going to lose the house. What about the children and my marriage? It's all over. So my thoughts are getting more and more catastrophic, and they're going round and round in this kind of circular way. So again, I later discover when I learn more about mental illness that this kind of rumination is very common. I remember feeling it was a bit like a skater on the ice, and my thoughts were going round and round and round and round, and the marks were getting deeper and deeper, and I couldn't control them. So I lay there feeling iller and more frightened and more panicked and more anxious. And I also had this very alarming sensation that I was falling. I kept having this thing that I had to sort of hold on to something, which you can imagine was a very frightening feeling. Anyway, being this supposedly kind of high-functioning type, the next morning I thought, right, I will refasten activity to a normal timetable. I'll breakfast at breakfast time, I'll lunch at lunchtime, I'll dine at dinner time, and I will sleep at night time. Unfortunately, I couldn't get to sleep. The following night, I felt iller. I couldn't eat. I felt breathless. And this pattern continued for the next 3-4 days, happened very, very suddenly, very intensely. And on about the fourth night, when I had become really quite hysterical, I found myself in hospital. And when I got to hospital, I said, look, no, you made a mistake. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't know, maybe something's happening with my heart. Maybe I'm having a heart attack. But look, I'm not a sort of a depressed sort of person. And the doctor said, well, I'm a psychiatrist and you are in a mental hospital. And the reason you're here is because you are showing the classic symptoms of an anxiety-driven major depressive episode, which was all news to me. So what happened was, to cut a long story short, I was very ill. I was treated mainly with drugs. So we're back in 97. Heavy sedatives, sleeping pills, antidepressants. As you probably know, antidepressants either are divided into ones that roughly cheer you up, like Prozac, or my kind of antidepressants are things that calm you down and generally sort of sedate you. So I did get better. I got better more or less, by which I mean I was sort of able to get back to work, which was my definite agenda, for about 6 months. So I went back to the Times and I changed absolutely nothing. I had my busy, stressful, demanding life, and I kept going, and I told almost nobody that I had been so very ill. I told my news editor because I had to, but I didn't really tell anybody else. More than that, I didn't really tell myself. I just shut the topic down. I thought it was a very scary thing to say I had a mental illness. I thought it was very scary to say that I was a sort of depressed person. I didn't really feel a depressed person. I'm actually a very positive, optimistic person, but I can also be a very anxious person. So I think there's something there about labels, and I loved Raymond's point about a diagnosis and a person. So anyway, I kept going, but unfortunately, as in the pattern, is the pattern with depression, I had a second major depressive episode. This is very common. Many of you will know. I remember thinking at the time it was a bit like a watercolour, where the colours darken each time. Because the truth is, if you've had one major depressive episode, your second one is likely to be worse. And that's exactly what happened to me. So a few years later, I had a second major depressive episode, and I was ill for more like 2 years. By which I mean I was really unable to function. I know how unable I was to function because I used to judge it in terms of the school runs. So I'm a mother, and any mother here will know how important it is to try and pick your child up. And I know that I didn't do a school run for 2 years. And I minded very much about that. So that was about 10 years ago, more or less, that I got out of the sort of severe phase. And it was really then that I decided that I couldn't really go on being in denial and actually being the victim of my own stigma much longer. And I had to do something about this thing called mental illness. Because I knew the pattern was that if I had a third major depressive episode, I was likely to be iller for longer. And I didn't want that. Who would? So really then I thought, okay, so I acknowledge that mental illness is an illness and something happens to your brain. Interestingly, we know remarkably little about what does happen to your brain. It's a huge area of research. I think the only thing after 10 years of looking into the topic that I think we could all safely say is that the brain is a very complicated thing. And we have little understanding really about exactly what happens. And even since I've been involved in mental health, some sort of, what you might call conventional certainties have changed. For example, the simplicity of the sort of serotonin and whether we've got enough serotonin or how antidepressants work. So, having said that, obviously, I think that mental illness is something happens to your brain, but I do passionately think that it happens in a context. And actually, why shouldn't it happen in a context? You know, some kind of diabetes happens in a context. You are going to be more vulnerable to diabetes if you eat a lot of sugary food, of course. And what I found in my own journey and working with others, so I work alongside a lot of mental health charities. I'm a volunteer at my local prison, and I run workshops at my local hospital for people who suffer from anxiety and depression. So what I began to discover, the more I looked into the topic, that there was this context in which either mental illness flourishes, or, as it happens, you can do a lot to improve your own likelihood of succumbing to depression and anxiety. So that's really what I decided to do. I tried to learn what could I do, what lifestyle interventions, as they're called, could I take up that would make it less likely that I would fall victim for a third time to a major depressive illness. And I would never say never, but so far, as I say, I have recovered every year, and I feel stronger now and better now. And while I wouldn't wish what's happened to me on anyone, I feel depression has made me who I am. And it's not something that I am any more ashamed of or unable to talk about, or to take some kind of responsibility about what I need to do to look after my mental health. So what I want to do is I just want to share the sort of strategies that I've used to stay calm and well. I know that later today we're going to hear from some other speakers who perhaps will share, chatting to the wonderful Stephen earlier, who may share a few more sort of ideas around how they have flourished in terms of getting the right care, the right support in the NHS, the right care through services. What I'm going to share with you more are sort of things that people can do on their own. Because I think what I found in my experience was there was a lovely virtuous circle, which was that if you could get over that total feeling of inability to do anything which comes with severe depression, if you could begin to nudge towards the light, you could move to a wonderful virtuous circle whereby the very fact of taking some responsibility for your mental health in turn made you feel better, which in turn made you feel more responsible. So I think that's what I want to share, is strategies which are really not reliant on others, but strategies which are more reliant on yourself. So if we, just to go to some slides, I've now written 4 books about this holistic approach to mental health, and this is actually was my 3rd book, was Walking on Sunshine, How to Build Resilience and Wellbeing, and that's really sums up what I'm going to share with you. So just for the first slide, I'll just give you a moment to read that. I will, yeah. So, it's a surprisingly physical sensation with a surprising resemblance to coronary pain, because it too is total, but it cannot be relieved quickly. It even threatens life. It is oneself and not part of one's machinery, a form of total paralysis of desire, hope, capacity to decide what to do, to think, or to feel, except pain and misery. The reason I have this is because this was written by Dr. John Horder, who at the time was the head of the Royal College of GPs, and he'd actually had cancer, and he'd also had a coronary heart attack. And what struck me was he said that the physical pain of anxiety, severe depression, could be as bad or worse than either of those. And I think this was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, was to acknowledge the physicality of the illness, which is how physically unwell you feel. But in addition, therefore, there is something about how we can approach our mental health through our physical health. Because I think what I've learned is that it's not just that mind and body are connected, they're indissoluble. So our physical health and our mental health absolutely deeply one and the same in my view. So moving on, so I can do this one. Okay, so what I want us to do is we're going to try a few things together as a group. I think that in terms of sort of physical approaches, I think I really wished that I'd known about some of the breathing and mindful techniques sooner in my own journey. Because when I look back at my anxiety, and indeed the people that I work with, is if you think about it a minute, one of the obvious characteristics of that kind of runaway thinking when I was lying there and I couldn't get to sleep is essentially I wasn't in the moment. So I was worried about the future. I won't pay, I'll lose the job, the children, da-da-da. And I was regretting the past. If only I hadn't taken on too much and I, da-da-da, somehow had a different life. But essentially I wasn't in the moment. And if you think about breathing for a moment, you can't breathe in the future and you can't breathe in the past. So it's really the simplest and easiest technique I found to start dealing with my own anxiety, and it's something that we can all do for ourselves. Anybody in the room already use some breathing exercises or mindful breathing techniques? Okay, a few of you. So I thought my invitation would be just to experience one, especially those that never tried it. And I think all these strategies that I'm going to share with you, I feel very, very strongly that my experience is that people are very complicated and nuanced and different. And actually what happens in the well-being world is that people get very messianic about their approach. And I understand that because it's wonderful when something works. So what tends to happen is that the sort of the mindfulness and meditation people think it's all about that. And the nutritionists think it's all about nutrition. And the stress management people think it's all about that. But actually what I find is that people need to kind of assemble their own toolbox, their own toolkit. And it could embrace a number of different messages and strategies. And therefore, if this exercise, which we're about to do, if it doesn't mean anything for you, that's okay. All right? So I just invite you to relax. You might want to close your eyes. You don't have to. Shake your shoulders. Just relax. And let's have a go. Take note of how you feel. Try to become more aware of your body, your feet on the floor, your clothes against your skin, the beating of your heart, and the rhythm of your breath. Notice your thoughts. Just observe them with an open, non-judgmental curiosity. Sometimes labeling them can help. Planning, worrying, and then gently let them go, like leaves floating down a stream. And now, bring your attention inward and focus solely on your breathing. Don't feel you must change your posture, position, thoughts, or breath. Just become aware of each inhalation and exhalation and how your body moves as you breathe. And now expand your attention outward, once more to the whole of your body. Pay attention to how your body feels, to what is on your mind, and to the space around you. And at this stage, you might like to turn your thoughts to others, put your own experience into perspective. And now, gradually open yourself up to your surroundings, and we will resume. Okay, thank you very much. I was actually just reading, as I say, this is a book I did about 18 months ago now, and in this book I use a variety of breathing exercises. That was one really about a kind of acceptance of breathing. I mean, there are breathing exercises where you can change the way you breathe. They can be effective in different ways. I use them all the time, and I use them with my children, I use them in my groups. So I would really think that that's something that's been very helpful to me. Let's try this other one. Okay, what you got to do is you just got to start laughing. Can you do that? Just keep laughing. Keep laughing. Come on, you're not doing very well. Come on, you got to laugh. Laugh, 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 laugh. Come on, a bit harder. You're about the worst audience I've ever had. Laugh, laugh, laugh. Okay. All right. You're getting the gist. I just think there's something there about laughter as the ultimate being in the moment. And, I think it's interesting the way that bridge works in terms of sometimes, a sort of lightness of touch, which is one of the things I like about the charity. And I think there's something there about laughter. Okay, moving on. You are a sophisticated audience. Nobody needs me to tell you about the importance of exercise. It was interesting that Raymond mentioned it as one of the key things is to get people moving. I just give you a second. I don't know if you can read at the back. I just was struck by this because we all know about exercise, but in this question of motivation, which I think Raymond also touched on, which is, how do you get people to make these sorts of changes? And I remember, again, that was a light bulb moment when I saw that slide, because just look how many of our systems, as it were, not just our mental health systems, but all our systems, our bodily systems, are affected by exercise. In terms of motivation, I think, this question, how do you get people to embrace some of these good habits? I think one of the things I would say is that we need to trick our brains. Don't wait for motivation to strike. It's quite the opposite. Have the cold shower, go for the run, and the motivation follows. That's actually how our brains work, and there's lots of evidence around that. Okay, nutrition has become a really huge interest of mine. I started working with a nutritional therapist 5 years ago in this sort of ongoing quest, because I still wasn't feeling that great, and I was still thinking, well, what could I do to improve my health? And I was very interested in some of the research that was coming forward. I bet some of you here have heard about some of this work going on about the microbiome, the gut flora. Quite a few of nodding here. So I think it's a huge topic, and I've written a whole book about it, which is The Happy Kitchen, Good Mood Food, which I wrote with this nutritional therapist. But I think that the sort of takeaway, dread phrase, but what I would like you to kind of hang on to, I think the thing that most helped me was that our brains actually don't work in isolation at all. Our brain is connected through the vagus nerve directly to our stomach. And our stomach sends messages to our brain, and our brain sends messages to our stomach, which is why the stomach has been dubbed the second brain. Now, you all know that when you think of things like gut feeling, or you feel sick to your stomach. So it turns out that there's a huge amount of research, and it's growing all the time, about what we can do to improve our gut flora, our microbiota, to make us less anxious, and to improve our mental well-being, which to me is incredibly exciting. And one of the reasons it's so exciting is because scientists are now looking at a whole new view of mental illness, that it may be to do with a chronic, low-level of inflammation. And I've been very lucky to work with King's College London and the leading professor on this, who's called Carmine Parmentier. I really recommend his work. But what is so electrifying to me, because of the fact that only probably 30% of people for sure do not respond to antidepressants at all. That's absolutely, ask the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And the reason that is so devastating for those people is that big drugs companies like GSK are not trying to develop new medication for depression. They're not looking to do new antidepressants because the drugs are considered a success. As it happens, they're not a success for 30% of people. But what's exciting is that King's College London is doing work that some of the people that do not respond to medication are responding to some of this work, trying to dampen down these levels of inflammation. And one of the very best ways to do that, and where the most compelling evidence is around omega-3s and the healthy fats. So what we did in this book is we took 150 pieces of nutritional research and we translated them into 70 recipes reflecting the symptoms of mental distress. So we looked at what the research shows for what you can eat to sleep, to improve low mood, to make you less calm, other way around, more calm, to improve your mental clarity, to improve your hormonal balance, and also a key chapter on kind of comfort. Because any of you here who worked with people with mental illness know that if you feel pretty low, what do? You go for a sugary snack. And you want to cheer yourself up that way. So we were very keen to think of ways to use food as your friend. And I was very, very keen that this book should be called The Happy Kitchen. And my publisher said, well, you're not going to do anything with it unless you call it The Happy Diet. And I was determined not to do that because I don't want that. I feel that my approach to nutrition is about nutrition as nourishment, and that food is your friend, and that learning how to cook and be in a happy kitchen is a big part of it. It's been a big part of my recovery. just a quick summary. Probably the most promising areas of research around healthy fats. So our brain is made of 60% fat. Almost instant results for some people on supplementation with omega-3s, which is really exciting. I was with a wonderful psychiatrist from the Maudsley last night, Dr. Pratima Singh, who's one of the sort of leading psychiatrists going for this kind of integrative, holistic approach. And she said that when the very first thing she does with her patients, all of whom who've got severe mental illness, because they're only seeing her, you only get to see a psychiatrist, as you know, if you've got severe mental illness, she said that she gets results in 1 day for people who start to deal with sugar. And she said they're easy, mnemonic, and I've started to use it myself, is watch out for crap. So refined sugars, additives, can't think what P is for. She only told me it yesterday. Processed foods. Don't want processed foods. I'll have to think what C stands for. Anyway, those would be the sort of key messages that I think that I've learnt on nutrition. On this microbiome, and what you want is a healthy gut flora. The simplest and the most compelling evidence is around something called kefir. Anyone heard of kefir? Did a lovely experiment recently. They took the probiotic drinks you can get in a supermarket. They compared them with the sort of fibrous vegetables, things like leeks and juice from artichokes that feed the right kind of bacteria, and this thing called kefir, which is a sort of fermented milk. It's incredibly easy to make. You can get it online. And basically, in terms of the diversity of the bacteria, which is what we want, you get 1 extra bacteria by eating the vegetables, and you get between 10 and 12 extra kinds of bacterial strain by going for the kefir. So that's a really simple thing that someone can start doing straight away. So what I love about nutrition is 3 times a day, you've got a choice to make a healthy decision. And in that question of motivation and how do you make a change, you keep getting another chance at the nutrition. You know, you can make a mistake, but you get another chance. You get it wrong at breakfast, you can get it right at lunch. Okay, alcohol is a depressant. Not a problem for me. I'm teetotal. I got very drunk when I was about 15, and I've never really drunk since. The reason I include that is I just think it's really important that when you're working with people about well-being is that everybody is so different. And some people will find some of the things I'm sharing with you really hard. You know, I mean, for some people, exercise is just impossible. In fact, Pratima, this psychiatrist I was working with last night, she said she doesn't call it exercise, she calls it movement. She said she doesn't want to say exercise because she doesn't do any, but she does lots of movement. And I mention that because this is an easy one for me, alcohol. It's not easy for lots of other people. Some of the other things I've been sharing have been really hard for me. And I think that's just something to really always bear in mind about really trying to listen to people about what actually works for them. And it may take them a long while to find these kind of lifestyle interventions that actually work and the mix of them that work, because so often they work together. So there's lots of evidence around how exercise also improves digestion. In fact, one of the problems with nutritional research is it's very hard to pull out what is the effect of the nutrition versus what are the other things you're doing at the same time. So that's what I would say. This kind of smorgasbord toolkit approach allows people to find what works for them. And for everybody, it is very, very, very different. One size, as we all know, doesn't fit all. What I think I learnt on insomnia, which was just such a key thing for me. Okay, thank you. I've got 10 minutes, so we're doing really well in terms of timing. What I learnt on insomnia was that actually the key breakthrough was that it wasn't so much the lack of sleep. I remember still being in and out of hospital, and I remember a different psychiatrist actually, because you sort of never get to stay with the same guy, but anyway, he said, well, look, it's not really the lack of sleep, it's worrying about it. And I know that sounds really simple, but it was a real breakthrough, because I am often up at night. I'm sure, quick show of hands, everybody, who here is often up at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning? Okay, lots of us. So tonight, we'll do a little wave. We'll all be awake at 3 in the morning. That's okay. What's not okay is to be lying there feeding your anxiety. And that's what I was doing. So I think that's just a very simple kind of breakthrough sort of comment for me. And sometimes I think, you know, what I'm sharing sounds really simple. And actually, I think this can be a problem, because I think sometimes mental illness is so complicated and it's so difficult and it's so hard to understand why people suffer. And I sometimes even wonder myself, why did I crash in this dramatic way? I've had such a privileged life, and, yet I went down so heavily. And I think it's often a sort of mismatch, in a way, between the subtlety and difficulty of the truth of mental illness, and sometimes the simplicity of ideas to get better. And I think that can sometimes be a problem for people. That, very clever people who are not even, or anybody, they find it hard that sometimes something very simple, like one tilt of the rudder, one small step can just lead them to the sunshine. And sometimes people kind of resist that. Okay, so we're going to do a few psychological ideas. I've shared so far, everything has been about your physical body, and they've all been things you can sort of do yourself. I'd like you to get into pairs. Please don't get into a pair with somebody you already know. Got to be somebody you've never met. Can you do that? Yeah? Okay, we're going to do this really quickly because we've only got 10 minutes. So normally you would have 3 minutes, okay, each side, but we're just going to do a sort of speed dating 1 minute. So what I want you to do is I just want, with your partner, each of you take it in turns, whoever starts, just brainstorm 3 things you're grateful for. Bang, bang, bang. Could be nice lunch, your job, your marriage, whatever. 3 things you're grateful for. You've got 1 minute, and I'm actually going to start timing you, and then you swap. That's all you have to do. Okay, off you go. Okay, well done. Round of applause. Thank you very much. I think gratitude's really interesting. It's made a huge difference to me. There's lots of good exercises. There's the 3-step gratitude exercise. You keep a note. I have a gratitude notebook. I write down things I'm grateful for every day. It's a really easy mind shift set that you can switch around. And I highly recommend it as a strategy that can change your psychological way you look at things. And look how jolly you all were. I mean, it's just wonderful to see such smiley faces, and, it really works. And you can use that exercise, you can do it within a firm, or, you have someone, your gratitude buddy, you swap things with routinely. It's often better with somebody else, but all these things you can do on your own. Okay, can we just try this as a group? I think that one of the things I noticed about myself, and I noticed it with others, is this thing about when. When this happens, then I'm going to be okay. When I've done that, then my health is going to be, when I've, sold 1 million copies, or when I'm the chief executive, or whatever. Can I just have some show of hands? Someone to be brave. Who has a when in their life? When I'm thin. I gave that. Did I do that one? When I'm thin, I will be happy, yeah. Come on, sure you will have whens. Yes, thank you.
When the children are grown up.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, when the children are grown up. Any others? Come on. Yeah, lovely, thank you. Lovely. When I stop waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Come on, a few more. When I'm thin. Yep, thank you. Honest. Very good. Any others? A few more. 1, 2, 3 more. No? When it's the summer. Okay. You get my point. It's just something to watch. My training is as a journalist and a writer, so I'm always interested in language and language we use. So just watch the whens and the oughts and the shoulds. Okay, whizzing on. You probably all know about flow. Do you all know about flow? A few of you nodding. I think the learning on that for me, flow means when you find an activity which matches your ability and you're fully absorbed. So I love gardening. Some people love knitting. Quick show of hands, what do people like where that is they're fully absorbed and they don't think about anything else. They're not worried. Sorry? Cooking, thank you. I love cooking. Yes? Football, you've done it twice. You're top of the class. Yes? Anyone else? Yes? Riding a motorbike, you're also up there. Anybody else?
Reading.
Sorry? Reading, yep.
Knitting and crochet.
Knitting and crochet, lovely. Okay, what I would say on that is, again, might sound really obvious. I think the difference for me now is that I don't feel guilt-tripped when I do stuff that I love. That's actually really important for your mental health. It's not an add-on. It's not an extra. It's not when I've got time, I'll do my golf or my knitting or my crochet or my cooking or whatever it is that gets you into the flow. That's a very important part of your toolkit to stay well and calm. Okay. One of my particular tools is that I love literature and poetry. And my first book was a poetry anthology, and it was all the sorts of poems that consoled and helped me find a different narrative. Poetry's remained a great love of mine. Anybody know who wrote those lines? Okay. Anybody heard of George Herbert? Yes. Okay, George Herbert, to me, one of the great all-time English poets, 17th century poet, almost certainly would have had depression in my view. And all his poems are about consolation and finding a different narrative. So grief melts away like snow in May, and who would have thought my shriveled heart could have recovered greenness? And I think sometimes the sort of beauty and dignity of language is something that we forget in terms of recovery and well-being. And some of the language is dire. I mean, lifestyle intervention, dire, in my view. But I think what I would say is that everybody finds their own mix. That's something important to me. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. I've tried to share with you my own sort of journey, my own learning, what's worked for me. I think most of the things that I've shared with you are evidence-based, but I don't absolutely think that everything has to be evidence-based. I think that sometimes there's not always evidence for things that do work, and sometimes it's not as simple as the fact that there's been some observational study. You know, there's a kind of mystery to being human, and there's a mystery to our truth of being well and happy, which is very individual. So I hope I've shared something there, and thank you very much. Very happy to take any questions.
Essentially, I wondered, there's so much pressure on us nowadays to aspire to something better.
Yeah.
You talked about the language that's used. I'm particularly interested in what you feel this does to children, and are we breeding a generation, are we bringing up a generation who have this wishing idea and wish list idea imprinted in their minds and their psyche?
Okay, huge topic. How are we bringing up the next generation and sort of teenage mental health? I'm an ambassador for Young Minds, so it's a subject close to my heart, and I'm also a mother. On this kind of, when you say like wish list, yes, do you see like kind of perfectionism and we're sort of not good enough, that kind of attitude, and the sort of way social media is always comparing us with people? Okay, I think the device I use on that, which seems to be helpful, is this idea of the midpoint. So find your midpoint. And I think what that's meant for me is that if you buy into a culture of success and perfectionism, which you could say I sort of had done in the sort of earlier me, the problem with that is that it's always going to be transitory. You know, your star will always crash. And if you're only defined on the basis of your success, you're sort of setting yourself up for failure, because you're only going to feel okay for as long as you enjoy that kind of success, which is a whole nother topic of how you define success. But if you have this idea that you're trying to establish a kind of midpoint, that you're okay, you don't buy into the success. Now, the great virtue of that is that if you don't buy in to sort of measures of success, so for teenagers it might be things like Twitter followers or likes on Facebook. If you don't buy into that, the lovely thing about it is you don't buy into failure. Do you see what I mean? Because you can't crash if you've never bought into the success. So somehow, I suppose Kipling said it, you know, treat success and failure, and treat those two imposters just the same, which is in his poem If. But I think there is something there for me, which is to be not to try and avoid that sense of defining myself by, you know, whatever we perceive to be success. So, for example, in my case, I never look at my sales figures. My publisher's saying, "Oh, have you not looked at your sales?" No, I said I never ever would look at them, because it does nothing for my mental health. It loses the midpoint. Is that helpful? Thank you.
I mean, I've certainly got a question for you. I'm just interested to know what you think about the culture. So speaking as a man, and what culture expects of as men and a successful man.
Yes.
Talking about mental health is often quite difficult. Do you see, as a woman, there's a difference in the way that sort of society portrays? We've got lots of powerful men being shown every day on the news in suits and striding around. they're not talking about mental health. No one seems to be accepting that these people have the same problems. Do you find that odd? I mean, I look at the television and I think, God, that's really weird, you know.
Okay, well, no, you're absolutely right. So, basically, women present twice as often with depression as men. That doesn't necessarily mean that they suffer more. It may be exactly your point, that they are able to acknowledge it, and in addition, they tend to have more contact with their GPs, so particularly through 20 to 45, when sort of childbearing and they're and all the menopausal bumps that women go through. So the rough rule of thumb, women are more in touch with doctors, so they often find it easier to talk about their depression. I think it's beginning to change, though I hate to share that the suicide figures under young men are going up, despite people like Prince William and Harry and Heads Together and all the different campaigns that it's okay for men to talk about mental health. So I think you're right. It's a really big problem, you know, what do we do about it? I mean, I think probably for me, the worst problem is that in a way, whether it's men or women, I'd say for me, my experience is that stigma is worse for people like me, in the sense that if you suffer real social deprivation and you can't keep food on the, you haven't got food on the table, there's a real understanding almost that you might be depressed, because you think, well, obviously, your life's really hard. And equally, there's a kind of world of celebrities and sort of showbiz types, and all credit to them, who have talked about their mental illness. But again, there's a slight sense, well, they're kind of crazy and artistic, and they might be up and down. But I think for men and women, but probably particularly for men, that people in a kind of middle cohort who don't obviously have anything to be depressed about, so they've got a job. They might be running a small business, or an accountant, or, I don't know, a banker, a journalist, a doctor. And I think for those men, they find it really, really hard to talk about mental illness, because they think, a supposedly privileged life means a privileged health, which obviously it doesn't. So I think that's where stigma's at its most rife. Does that
No, that
help?
does. Yeah, it's very helpful.
I just wanted to do my own tiny gesture to support Bridge. So what I've done is I've just given a few copies of my book, and they will be on the Bridge website if anybody's interested, and any proceeds will be going to the charity. So just wanted to support your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.